Hey guys, so today I'll be taking you through a brief description and tutorial on exactly how you can undervolt your GPU on your Nvidia system or whichever system you're working on right now. So the primary software that we'll use for undervolting your GPU is MSI Afterburner. So just make sure you have that installed, and also River Tuner, which is part of the package of MSI Afterburner. And finally, we'll also use GPU Z to monitor the GPU voltage that we are currently running at, and especially the one that we run at while under load. And finally, you can also use a GPU bound either game or benchmark. Normally, the Unigine, Heaven, and Valley benchmarks are very GPU bound as opposed to CPU bound. And the reason why you want to use a GPU bound application is because you want to test it under maximum GPU load. Because if you test it with a game that runs on, let's say, 80% GPU load, when you actually run into a game that uses 100%, you may find that the undervolt that you applied was actually unstable. Yeah, so in this case, I'll use Dirt Rally 2. So let's open that up right now. The primary values that you want to have displayed on your overlay, the what do you call it? The OSD, are the GPU core clock, the GPU usage percentage, the GPU temperature, and the CPU values. You can also have them displayed just to make sure you're keeping good tabs on them, as well as the frame rate of your system. Yeah. So we'll jump into just any random stage right now in the game. Let's do that right now. The primary reason why you'd want to undervolt your GPU is to give you some marginal improvements in GPU temperature while playing games. It's not as drastic or as significant as the CPU undervolting, but you can actually benefit depending on your system and your specific GPU. So my system is currently running the GTX 1060. Yeah, so just as a quick reference point, you can see that the GTX 1060 is actually operating at a frequency of 1671 MHz on the GPU core and about 99% saturation on the GPU. This is actually the level that you want to have it at, just to make sure that you're getting as much of a realistic benchmark as possible. So, and also the frame rate, if you can notice, it's sitting at about 76 to 77 frames per second. So now that we have that out of the way, we can quickly go back into MSI Afterburner and try and apply a stable overclock on your GPU. Now, for reference, my system uses about 180 megahertz overclock on the core and about 300 megahertz on the memory. I've found that to be the stable point. So it may vary for your system, but it's just a matter of you finding out where your system sits comfortably. Yeah, so here I'll apply 180 what do you call it? 180 megahertz overclock on the core and about 300 megahertz on the memory. Then before we apply that, let's just go back quickly into Tech Power Up GPU Z and see what our max voltage value was. So here, if you notice, the max voltage was about 0.893 volts on the GPU. So this was at a frequency of 1671 megahertz. Yeah, and maximum saturation on the GPU. So now that we have all those baselines, I can apply the overclock, and then now we quickly jump back into the game. So back in the game now, we can actually see that our GPU core clock has gone up significantly from 1671 to around 1835, 1848 megahertz. And the frame rate has also gone up. It's now sitting at about 81 to 82 frames per second. And the GPU is still at 99% saturation. Yeah. And so now that we've seen that, let's go back now into GPU Z. So if we now take a look at our max GPU voltage, we can see that it's actually not gone up any more than the point that it was. In fact, it's sitting at if you scroll through the graph values, you can actually see that it's sitting at around anywhere between 0.86 to about 0.89. Yeah, so that's more or less the stable voltage that it has found that it will sit at for that particular frequency. So now that we have most of our data, we can now go into the MSI Afterburner. So you'll click on the graph and then press Ctrl F on your system to bring up the frequency versus voltage graph. Yeah, so what this graph does is it allows us to undervolt our GPU. Undervolting of a GPU is a lot more complicated than undervolting of the CPU. And this is primarily because GPUs operate in a much wider range of frequencies, power levels, power states, and also just basically it's a lot more dynamic than a CPU core, and it has a lot more variables. So the way we do the undervolt is we'll set this graph to sit at a level that is the minimum stable voltage for our particular overclock value. So I don't know if that has made sense. Let me repeat myself. These values here that you can see are the voltage relative to the frequency of the GPU. So like, let's say if I click on this particular frame here, you can see that the GPU has a stock definition of 1607 megahertz at 0.762 volts. So what we want to do is we want to get our maximum stable GPU overclock, which in my case was around 1835 megahertz. And then we look for the voltage value that corresponds to that particular frequency, GPU core frequency. So one thing I found just through my testing, and it's something that you can actually notice just to avoid all the frustration, is try and be a bit conservative with the GPU frequency. So like in my case, now that I know that 1835 is the max GPU core clock, I actually went to the more conservative value of around 1775 on the GPU core clock for testing of my undervolt. And this is just to have a bit of a safety buffer, because most of the time I actually found when I try and undervolt at this particular 1835 frequency, my system was always crashing. Yeah, so now that we have that out of the way, we can see that 1775 sits at around this level here. Yeah, that's 1771, and the voltage defined for that particular frequency is about 843 millivolts, which is around 0.843 volts. So what we'll now do is we'll now have all the other values sitting at this particular 1771 level. And the reason for that is you don't want your system to overclock any further beyond this 1771 point that you found is the more stable value. It may vary depending on your particular system, But once you've identified that specific core frequency, you want to keep it at that level. So now we'll proceed to move all the other, what do you call them? All the other coordinates down to that level, just to make sure that we don't go beyond it. And you want to be as careful as possible. Try and make sure that all of them are evenly placed along the same line on the graph. And this is to prevent any possible fluctuations that you may face while your system is running. So here I'll just try and position them. It can be plus or minus 5 megahertz, but just try and keep it within that range. Yeah, so I'll just try and do this very quickly. So now that we are done lining up the graph values, what we can see is we've actually been able to set the maximum GPU frequency that we'll allow on the system. And if you can see, the system will therefore choose the minimum voltage value that corresponds to that particular frequency. So like in our case currently, before we even start doing the undervolt, we can already see that we've been able to set a GPU frequency of about 1771 at a voltage of about 0.843 volts. So this, as you can notice, based on our previous maximums, is actually lower than the 0.893 volts that we were previously operating at. Yeah, so this is already, as it stands, an undervolt. Yeah, so the next thing that we'll need to do from here is you can now close this tab, and then you can see here the core clock definition has changed from whatever numerical value it had previously to curve. And this is because it's actually using the curve. If we press Ctrl F, we can actually see it's using the curve that we've defined through this previous step. So the next thing you need to do is just to make sure you have a reference for it. So save it in one of your presets and then apply. Now, during this application process, you may find that your system might crash on occasion. So you just need to be careful at this point and keep tabs on whatever voltage values you are using that before any crash happened. So I'll apply that undervolt right now. I'll go back into the game to just monitor exactly how well the system is doing with this new undervolt. So, but before I do that, I'll need to close GPU Z and open it up again, just to make sure the definitions for the maximum GPU voltage are actually changed. Yeah, so you can see now here we have different max and min values that we can keep tabs on. So when I open the game again, now what we can observe is we are getting a maximum GPU frequency of about 1772 megahertz and a frame rate of about 79 frames per second, which is very close to the frame rate that we were getting previously with the maximum stable GPU. What do you call it? With the previous maximum stable GPU core clock. Now, if we go back into GPU Z, we can actually see that the maximum GPU voltage has actually gone down from 0.89 to 0.85 volts. So that's already a benefit to our performance, because we've been able to undervolt it and it's still stable and it's able to keep a pretty high GPU overclock. So the next thing we can do from there is now we can start playing around with the graph. So as you can see, these values are all sitting at about 17. It normally, what happens, by the way, as I forgot to mention, is that it tends to edit the graph very slightly based on what exactly you had defined. So in our case here, we can find that now it's moved all these values after our stable undervolt to a frequency of about 1785 megahertz, which is why it was sitting at 1785 megahertz. So the next thing we'd need to do is just edit this slightly. So now at 0.843, we'd want it to sit at that 1785 megahertz. So that's 1783, which is close enough. Now, even 0.831, we'd want it to sit at that 1785, 1783 mark. This 0.825 is a bit low, if you ask me, but in any case, we can now try and start tapering off the graph to slowly start coming down once it's gone past this 0.831 millivolt setting at 1783 megahertz. So now we can close this and click apply, and hopefully the system doesn't crash. And then we open up the game again. And now what we can see is we're sitting at, sorry, before I even do that, I need to close GPU Z and open it up again, just to make sure I've reset the max voltages that are registered. So we're keeping tabs on this max voltage. So let me open up the game. And now you can see we're sitting at 79 frames per second, and which is even normally, I mean, sometimes going up to as high as 80. And if we monitor the system's GPU voltage, now we're operating at 0.843 volts, which is actually even lower than the 0.85 that we've just observed. So now I'll close that and open it again. What we're now trying to do is just basically seeing where the maximum, or should I say the minimum stable voltage that your system can accommodate. So now we can go back into the graph yet again and further try and push down the system even further. So here we at 0.831, we're going to try and drag it to the 1785 mark. And maybe if we're even ambitious, we can try and do 0.825, and or rather, let's just start with the 0.831 and then see where that takes us. Click apply and then go back into your game. Just have it run for a few seconds just to make sure it's able to sit at its maximum voltage, and then now you can minimize it and then go back into your GPU Z. And now if we look at the maximum GPU voltage, we can actually see it's gone even further down to a value of 0.831 volts. So far, just off my calculation, we've gone down from an initial value of 0.893 to a value of 0.831 volts, which will actually mean that we've undervolted by around 0.062 volts, which is it's not as significant as, let's say, an undervolt that would normally happen on your GPU, I mean on your CPU, of around 0.0150. But it will actually give you maybe 2, 3, maybe even if you're lucky, maybe about 5 degrees Celsius extra thermal headroom for your GPU, especially if you're currently a bit temperature constrained. So what you'll do now is you'll just continue slowly working this value down until a point where unfortunately your system will end up crashing, and you'll get a blue screen. But there's no harm in that really, because what will happen is your system will blue screen and then it will restart, and then you can go back to the previous value that you were working with before the heavy undervolt. And then slowly you can work your way around the sweet spot between the maximum frequency that you'll allow on your GPU, as well as the maximum voltage that it will operate at that particular core clock. Yeah, so that's just been a brief description on how to undervolt your GPU. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comments section below. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.